Hi, my name's Tim Shields. When I was growing up, I found a lot of shows that were aimed at me as a young boy to be kinda trite. Stuff like G.I. Joe and He-Man always came off as overwhelmingly propagandistic or toyetic, to the point where even as a small child, I kind of felt condescended to, or maybe even preyed upon a little as an audience. I remember being put off by a lot of really creepy romances in kids media at the time. There was that episode of Power Rangers in Space where those two incels steal Cassie's diary and blackmail her into going on a date with them, and somehow the takeaway is like, don't judge a book by its cover, these two were sweet little fucking creeps the whole time. They were still mixing Pepe Le Pew into Looney Tunes runs, which made me super uncomfortable on an instinctive level that I wouldn't really truly understand the horror of until I was subjected to similar behavior later in life. And like, have you seen what's happened to the Earthworm Jim guy lately? This is what we call the deep end. You know what's messed up is originally I was going to write a little bit about Chuck Dixon using Robin as a soapbox to lecture women about their abortion rights when I was growing up, and how weird of a scene it was politically to be into comics, but, I mean, Roe v. Wade was overturned this week, so I feel like that bit has simultaneously aged really well and really poorly. Women were barely present and usually filled the same persistent roles in all of the shows that I was supposed to be watching. Obviously, this is a generalization. It's okay. There are plenty of women in children's media, even going back decades, who stand out as positive examples of female representation and less grody heterosexual romances. I'm not trying to cancel your favorite show. I'm not saying that Callie Briggs from SWAT Cats isn't an absolute badass, or that every woman in media needs to be a feminist milestone to be a success. Like, I'm a Takashi Miike fan, okay, I get it. Stuff is complicated. But that's the thing, these handfuls stand out of the masses for a reason. I think a wonderful example of what I mean by this sort of depiction of women in the mainstream boy-centric media of the time is the treatment of Janine from The Real Ghostbusters. Originally effectively a punchline machine, the Real Ghostbusters cartoon elevated Janine into a full supporting member of the team, making regular appearances and developing her relationship with Egon in a very wholesome and autistic way that was hugely impactful to me as a child. She was also given a much more authoritative position on the team, and the writers went to great lengths to make sure that she was never depicted as a sort of harpy figure. She was simply assertive enough to stand up to the Bill Murray archetype, and that is an essential component of the Bill Murray character arc, previously filled by Dana in the original film. This is good shit. How didn't they ruin it? Naturally, after 2 seasons of the show exploding into one of the biggest things on network television, the executives decided that the best thing to do would be to meddle, and Janine was the prime target. Writers were told that she was too bold, too assertive, too intelligent for television. I kid you not, this is an actual thing. Phalis made a whole video about it. They said that her glasses were too sharp, they were scaring little boys, and they had to be rounded down. In a show about hunting ghosts. The guy who came up with that, in 1 year, has made more money than I will ever see in my life. So yeah, you pair that with Dave Coulier-Venkman and a growing over-reliance on Slimer to carry some especially weak late-season writing, and I had to cut it out. As did the showrunner, J. Michael Straczynski, who quit very quickly after, and has been very public about his feelings on the matter ever since. When all of the stuff that you're supposed to like tells you that you're wrong for being yourself, eventually you start to feel a little out of place. However, my thirst for media was far too strong, and tokusatsu had taken far too firm a grip of me. What was I supposed to do? Simply go outside, touch grass, like some chump? I began to explore further into my local video stores, and one day, out of nowhere, arose a new section filled with cartoons that I'd never seen before. I rented one because I liked the cover and I liked the premise, and they forgot to put an NC-17 sticker on it warning my parents that it had boobs in it. It was called Ranma 1/2, and it changed my life forever. It tells the story of a boy who falls into a hot spring in China where a girl had drowned several hundred years prior. He's now cursed to turn into a female version of himself when he's splashed with cold water, and the effect is reversed by hot water. He becomes engaged to a tomboy named Akane and has to slowly unlearn all of his masculinist traits in favor of feminism, because this is a Rumiko Takahashi manga, and that's, like, her entire thing. This is irrelevant, but they had this super gory trailer for the Mermaid Scar OAV on exclusively the first printing of the first tape, which they immediately had to just stop using entirely forever because it traumatized so many people out of the blue, young Tim included. I was just immediately hooked on it. It was unlike anything I had ever seen before. The idea, the emphasis on platonic love between a male and a female, the tone of it, the romance. Upon learning it was created by a woman, and my store was limited to only the first 2 volumes, I decided to branch out to other works by or about women, and that was a game changer. Slayers was a massive hit with me, and Lena Inverse remains a tremendous inspiration in everything I do. Escaflowne is a wonderful tragedy, both in story and behind-the-scenes production. Cardcaptors is a campy time capsule of a localization mess, and Tokyo Babylon is actually probably the first queer story that I ever experienced. But more relevant for today is Naoko Takeuchi's magnum opus, Sailor Moon. I know this all sounds like deranged rambling so far, but I promise these are all points that are going to come together by the end of the video, okay? Hang in there. I discovered Sailor Moon one day in a record store, because back when I was growing up, you had to just sort of discover anime sometimes, like Narnia. It wasn't really freely available, and we were still a decade and a half away from streaming being a viable option. I'm 24, so that would be like 1998. Yeah, like 1990. There were still VHS then. Yeah, that tracks. That makes sense. I'm 24. I first bought the mid-season dramatic reveal 2-parter where Serena and Darian Shields, because that's his name, it's like my name, find out who they are and get separated from each other. It was all very dramatic and romantic and emotional in a way that I had never experienced in media directed at me as a young boy before. Even the villain deaths were treated with grace and dignity and pathos. Needless to say, as a 7-year-old, I was shook. I devoured the series in every format that I could get my hands on. I remember crying the day that I found out that the show had more than the 12 episodes that they released across 6 VHS. It had a deep and profound impact on who I thought that I had to be as a boy. I bought a doll and a wand at the toy store, but I always felt like I had to hide them. I had my sister wring them out and give them to me back when we got home. I was hoping that I could sidestep the awkward conversation with my father where he calls me slurs and then he laughs and I internalize it for 20 years, you know, that old joke. Eventually I got fed up and I decided to define myself for myself instead. I made peace with the masculine and feminine aspects of my personality and I eventually came out, and I've never been more content. It's a very weird point for me to look back on, because now we live in an era where people will just buy dolls and will just buy wands and will post about those online to share it with their friends and family and communities without worry of admonishment. I think that's incredibly healthy and I'm happy for those people, although a very small part of me is incredibly jealous. But what about the people who, unlike me, can't escape that toxic criticism, whether due to a lack of resources, a resentful parent, or a lingering unresolved trauma at the hands of a still-present abuser, which is very often the case for queer youths? And what are the narratives that inspired the media that I enjoyed so much as a child, like Sailor Moon, that went on to become such international smash hits across multiple demographics? Today's movie examines these questions, raising a microscope to the narratives of 3 previous Toei franchises and how they benefit us as an audience in a context decades removed from their original intent. Let's talk about Kamen Rider. Kamen Rider Wizard. Really? And Fourze. Movie War? Ultimatum. Oh my god, I'm just gonna call it the Poitrine movie, okay? Would you run the fuck? The movie opens on a trio of demons known as the Akumaizer 3 discussing their evil plans for the film, which we'll later discover are to drop a ship into a big magical well to create a shockwave that eradicates specifically humanity in vengeance for driving the demons underground years prior. I'm just going to say this quick right here. The plot device for this movie is a giant Mad Max truck, and A, I love that, but also B, it's literally driving the plot, and I think that that's adorable. A girl named Miope loses control of her bike, and she's saved by the titular Kamen Rider Fourze, Gentaro. She's revealed to be his friend and a member of the new Kamen Rider Club at Amanagawa High, where Gentaro is seen continuing his transformation from his series from a student into a full adult teacher. In class, they watch a presentation by Gentaro's old friend Yuki, who has become an astronaut and occultist. A student named Kazuta says that she'll be returned to Earth violently for trespassing in space. Miope tells him to shut up, and Kazuta tosses her across the room with psychic powers. He threatens anyone who sides against his plans with his group, the Neo-Humans, the next evolutionary path for humanity. They've formed a gang called the Kaijin Alliance and hope to use their powers to stop humanity from harming the environment. After an extended parkour sequence, Gentaro corners Kazuta, who turns himself into a cocoon man. He and Fourze do a fight, and it's incredibly solid. I'm not usually one for the action scenes in tokusatsu, but I mean, the movies do a great job with them just generally, and this one also focused the story, so like, they doubled down. You can't lose. Fourze states that Kazuta can really just do whatever he wants as long as it's not hurting other people, and he's gaining the upper hand when suddenly Banba, the guy that we've been warned about by Meteor, rocks up, blowing up the quarry as Meteor swings in to rescue Gentaro. There's this adorable montage of the pair getting the high school gang back together, and it's really lovely seeing that all these kids got to go on and live out their dreams. Especially Jake. I was really worried that they had turned into Gremlin. After this little family is done catching up, we're shown the polar opposite, a space-based cult where the most vulnerable other youths in the city are being rallied into violence against progress, which is represented by the space launch being headed by Gentaro's friend Yuki. This of course makes sense as Banba is revealed to be working with the Akumaizer 3 for money, which he values above life and identity, something that the cast pools their resources to both discover and voice their disdain towards. Gentaro sees rescuing these rogue former students as his ultimate test in becoming both a teacher and an adult. Banba arms the kids with his patches, which the Kamen Rider Club rocks up to reveal are secretly brainwashing their wielders. The people who find themselves accepted in this false community of hatred are invariably revealed to be puppets of a capitalist manipulating them for personal, financial, and political gain. The kids in the club team up against Banba, but Kazuta still wants revenge for his injustices. He attacks Fourze, revealing his history of abuse because of his psychic powers, and Gentaro calls him a coward for projecting his fear of intimacy as a reason to distance himself from other people and hurt them. It's the Hedgehog's principle from Evangelion. Miope offers Kazuta friendship, and Fourze throws away his driver, destroying it as a gesture of faith in the next generation to do the right thing. He explains to Kazuta that right now he's still growing, and he has time to change himself into something beautiful, but he has to accept himself first. Meanwhile, Banba arms a satellite cannon or some shit, who cares? Kazuta arrives on the scene confronting Banba, taking an ideological stand against his abuser, and transforms into a butterfly named Inazuman, putting a stop to the plans. However, Zatan of the Akumaizer 3 shows up and fires the cannon anyway, exploding the satellite with Yuki still on board. It seems all is lost until Gentaro's non-verbal autistic femme-presenting agender space slime girlfriend Nadeshiko comes to the rescue. The pair reunite and we get our first canon queer content of the movie, meaning that now we're in for the best part of any Kamen Rider production. Wizard being on screen. Also, Gentaro abducts his past self so that he can borrow his driver. Haruto Soma, or Kamen Rider Wizard, is eating donuts as a pack of ghouls stare him down. Monsters known as phantoms are holding people hostage, and he needs to evacuate them, so he decides to just kill all the bad guys with the best moves that the show has ever seen, because that's a pretty reliable tactic of his. It's magnificent, of course. Wizard is already the apex of practical tokusatsu fight choreography, and now it has a movie budget. Savor every frame of this, because it's showtime. The Akumaizer 3 watch the fight play out, all very impressed naturally, as Zavat returns with Banba's device. Satan asks Wizard to join them because he's also powered by demons, and Wizard just fucking rushes them because he takes a proactive stance to justice rather than a reactive stance. Several of Haruto's foes from the series, Medusa, Wise Man, and Phoenix, all show up in this movie, but they function mostly as set dressing, and that feels like an intentional choice to me. They don't approve of the Akumaizers, verbally so, because they contradict the Phantom's existence. The Phantoms are manifestations of internalized PTSD that's gone untreated in their hosts, called Gates, whereas the Akumaizers seem to simply exist for the sake of being demons. It robs the material of any substance. Satan manages to get the upper hand, and the Akumaizer 3 escape into the staged dream of one of their hostages. Haruto chooses to pursue, jumping into the central figure. Haruto wakes up in the antique shop in which he resides, and his friends Koyomi and Wajima inform him that it's Poitrine's birthday, which is utterly meaningless to him because he was born after it aired and Toei refuses to sub any of their uploads after episode 2. He spots phantoms attacking somebody in a park and heads out to help. His compatriots, Shunpei and Rinko, follow Haruto into the dream world, having similar experiences until they encounter Haruto riding by on a bike. Haruto dispatches the phantoms, noticing the adults seem to be in a daze. Shunpei and Rinko lead them away as Haruto holds off reinforcements. The kids recognize the pair as being from outside of this dream world, then run off to see Poitrine. Again, these are the best fight scenes that you are going to find in Kamen Rider, especially with the minimal CGI. Suddenly, the din is broken as a voice calls out from the sidelines and a woman steps forward, erupting into a full magical girl transformation sequence. We can recognize her outfit as the same one on the woman whose dream Haruto entered earlier, which explains her power set as she devastates the monsters to the approval of the crowd. This is her power fantasy, this is her dream. Haruto notices some phantoms running away and moves to pursue them, but Poitrine tells him not to bother because they'll just leave on their own. The monsters teleport away, and Haruto seems both confused and dejected by the idea that she's sparing them, given his knowledge of the damage that phantoms have wreaked on their host bodies, his own included. Returning to Haruto's home, as they walk in, all of his friends barely notice him, instead showering birthday praise on Poitrine. As she blows out the candles on her cake, Haruto has a seizure and passes out, reawakening at the start of this set of circumstances. Which, as we all know, can only mean one thing. We have a time loop. Haruto is freaked out by how gross and fake everyone is, OMG, literally me, and he drives off to find Rinko and Shunpei, who are reacting similarly and also being pursued. Haruto uses his dick magic to put their dreams to sleep, and the trio take a moment to breathe and collect themselves. The Akumaizers update us on their plan, which is primarily to keep Poitrine distracted, who they identify as Yu Kamimura. The three examine their evidence collected so far, discerning that if the kids are accounted for, then Poitrine must be the woman whose dream it is, and she's being preyed upon by this false reality in some way. The pair rush off to find her as Haruto deals with more phantoms to a jeering crowd. The audience sets off, disappointed, as Yu arrives, and she scolds Haruto for letting them down because they were waiting for Poitrine. He says she's becoming over-reliant on escaping into fantasy and needs to come back to reality. The kids can't escape her trauma as long as she's fixated on it, which makes sense given that she's acting as their guardian both literally and figuratively as Poitrine and their actual guardian at the moment. The Akumaizers appear, telling Yu that as long as she pushes this narrative, she's going to create an endless amount of monsters for Poitrine to fight. Yu reveals that she knew that this was a dream the whole time, and the Akumaizer Ganma shows up to goad her into removing Haruto from the world. She agrees and waves her wand, teleporting them to a cathedral where she can marry Haruto and absorb him into her trauma. Haruto is notably not upset by any of this and seems to sympathize. He says that there's no point in repeating every day, and she says that in real life every day is exactly the same anyway, except miserable, like that 9 Inch Nails song. He asks if she would really like for him to be a puppet, but their friends arrive on the scene before she can reply, with Rinko rocking up and just immediately unloading a clip into Ganma because this is just the best cast. The children beg Yu to come back to her life, and Haruto pleads on their behalf that he'll work with her to make her feel more accepted in reality if she agrees, because it can't just be about her doing it for other people. She also needs the help that she needs, and he understands that. Ganma attacks the kids for interfering, and Poitrine rejects him, accepting her maternal guardianship role and engaging with Haruto to finally confront her inner demons. The Akumaizer becomes a big vulture because it's preying on Yu's body, do you get it? And Haruto summons his dragon and they fly around and they do a big fight, and like the CGI is but like I love fire dragons. Like this whole fucking the show was written specifically for me. Poitrine apologizes and Haruto says it wasn't her fault. Suddenly, Zatan attacks, kidnapping Yu and surrounding Haruto with monsters as Part 2 comes to a close. Koyomi is evading phantoms when Meteor, Fourze, and Nadeshiko show up to bust some absolute ass. I'm sorry, you're putting wizard choreography on Fourze fights? That's broken. You ruined it. You broke Kamen Rider. It's done now. I love how much time this movie devotes to Nadeshiko just, like, mercilessly obliterating dudes. I think we only get to see her, like, 2 times in the entire series, but when we do, oh my god. Fourze and company jump into Yu's dream to back Haruto up, and I get so excited every time that I watch it. The group makes short work of the monsters in yet another amazing fight, and the Akumaizers continue to abduct Poitrine, now driving a Mad Max tank surrounded by an army through the streets of Japan. My 2 best friends are the best boys ever, and continue to be adorable for a while as Poitrine wakes up, damseled in the traditional fetishized way women so often are in media catering exclusively to young boys. And this is justified, A, by the 3 outdated villain archetypes based off of the 3 Musketeers, and B, because it reinforces that Poitrine is regarded as a woman in narrative. This is very cool, and I'll come back to both of these points in the conclusion. They even let Nadeshiko murder people outside of the suit in this one. I totally forgot. Oh my god. I love this movie. All the Wizard movies. That's the best movie, is all 3 of the Wizard movies. Those are great. A+++. So, I'm 6'9". I've been in a lot of fights over the years. I have studied multiple forms of martial arts, boxing, BJJ, Okinawa, Judo. Understand that in tokusatsu, when people get into big fights, I usually just tune out unless they're monologuing at each other about ideological differences, okay? Like, if I want to watch 2 dudes fighting, I'll just throw on a martial arts movie, right? So, please understand the significance when I say that the civilian rider fights in this movie have some of the most incredible fight choreography that I have ever seen in a movie. Like, I'm not saying that as just some dude who plays Tekken a lot. Like, as somebody who has done stuff like this, I think it's incredibly impressive how much these actors are able to pull off. Like, these aren't the suit actors. The suit actors, I mean, that's a whole other level. You've seen the fight at the start of this movie. But these are just the actors, and they're just all over the place. That's shit I can't do. Back at the Akumaizer base, Koyomi watches the phantoms begin to approach the hostages when suddenly she's blinded by a very familiar-looking pair of underwear. An unhoused man in a poncho appears to whoop they ass, as it were, and faithful viewers will recognize this man as Eiji Hino, or Kamen Rider O's. He appears in the dream to give the children rings shaped like the rest of the golden age of Heisei Kamen Riders, W, Axel, O's, and Birth, making this indisputably the best Rider crossover movie of all time, because those ones are the ones that I like. Oh my gosh, and then we get another fight, and it's incredible, and I'm so shocked, and we still haven't even gotten to the best part yet. The squad forms up in the traditional dual-line roll call, except it's my favorites this time, so it's better, and the Akumaizers stare them down in their Mad Max truck. So the boys earn the second half of their names by invoking their motorcycles and finally riding. Everything about the truck chase is dope. It's shot beautifully, the truck design is so cool, and I really love the incorporation of the GoPro motorcycle riding footage. It really puts you right in there. If I had to pick a favorite aspect, I think it's the way that the older riders fall back after launching their assaults, so that it's left up to Fourze and Haruto to deliver the final blows to fight for their generations. Like, it's a perfect visual representation of the themes of the film, and I think that's wonderful. Plus, Wizard has a dragon, okay? He didn't have to launch himself sideways on his motorcycle and jump off in midair and land on the back of a Mad Max truck. He did that for us. The pair arrive to face the villains and rescue you, both assuming their strongest forms, representing the growth that they've undergone during this film, and gaining ground quickly as the others race to catch up. Haruto and Fourze defeat 2 of the 3 Akumaizers, leaving only Settlers of Catan to fulfill their mission, which is unfortunate because Fourze uses magnets to kick him in the chest, and Haruto blasts him in the face with a flamethrower that lives inside of his torso. Poitrine thanks Haruto for what he's done, but Zatan is still alive to deliver Zavan, the big truck, to its payload. Everyone pools their resources into new toys, yes, I have them, naturally, and attains a new form to represent the fact that these 2 have become teachers to the next generation of heroes. Even the CGI fights in this one are good. I don't know how they did it. Please, somebody make me a worthwhile Kamen Rider game. I feel like Platinum would be really good for it, or maybe like a Yakuza-style one, like old Yakuza, but like with Ichigo, right? You just travel around and like help people with wacky side quests. And then, like, also there's a super serious core. I don't know. One of my friends the other day, this is them, they're on Twitter, was saying sports games. Like, I think that would fit really naturally with, like, Super Sentai especially. You know, they have all the, like, baseball episodes and, like, Go Ranger used footballs. But, like, I think Kamen Rider would be really good for something like, they were saying golf, but I think tennis, right? Because doubles, you know, you got your primary and secondary riders. I don't know. I mean, just make me more Kamen Rider games, please. We're getting an Ultraman Monster Rancher game that has a confirmed English release for 2022. Like, that's something. Toei, you gotta catch up to Supro. Come on. Just go watch this movie. It's amazing. They kick through his chest wicked hard, and everything explodes in traditional Toku fashion, because storytellers who exploit queer identity for corporate profit are scum. Everyone wakes up refreshed, and Haruto's tasked with cleaning up the divergent timelines they've created real quick because he has Zio's entire power set on one ring. The hostages wake up, and Yu Kamimura turns out to be Yu Kamimura, and everyone feels real fucking stupid. Especially because, and I'm just realizing this on this rewatch, the second segment opens with Haruto eating donuts from her shop. Which means that earlier that day, he literally saw her in the outfit that she was wearing the entire film. In the end, they are caught slipping on their allyship, having not considered Yu a potential identity for the woman under the mask, which is especially funny given that they know her name the entire movie and never put it together because of her age, despite it quite literally staring them in the face. Haruto realizes that he was flirting with a much older woman than he had originally intended due to how Yu sees herself internally, which, importantly, is revealed to be canonically how she looked at that age. I believe it's well-intentioned because of the rest of the film and, frankly, the series, never relying on her gender identity as a punchline. This is a guest director on the movie. But it does tread the line of shock trans reveal punchline tropes a little too closely for my liking, and it could very easily sour the experience for people who don't have the context of the show, and are apparently the intended audience of this film, and I think that that's a really sad note for it to go out on. And that's the thing, I could make excuses. It would be easy for me to say, you know, this is a guest movie director who took a creative liberty and ruined a joke that worked well enough on paper. The skirt-twirling meme that recurs throughout the movie, while rightfully acknowledging Yu and Nadeshiko as the women that they present as under the film's male gaze, still comes off as misogynistic and weird, despite being an apparent homage to the shoujo archetype. And the show treats Yu with a lot more respect in terms of her gender identity, never making it a punchline in favor of her personality being quirky. Sadly though, as much as I clearly love Wizard, I have no proof to back that up. It's conjecture based off of what I think some dude that I've never met was thinking one day. And that brings us to the point of the movie. So often these days I see people write off media as wholly great or wholly terrible, when usually it's a step on a journey to progress. That's why we need to think so critically about the messaging in the media that we consume. So this is a trans allegory, right? I don't think I'm going to get any kickback on this. It literally stars a trans woman and focuses her journey through her gender identity transition. Now, queers are not a monolith, much like autistics wear a spectrum, and it would be disingenuous of me to pretend that my incredibly privileged take on the media is the only one that matters. With that in mind, I would like to give my platform over to the creators at Henshin Sunrise and KomradeKrisis to divulge their thoughts on the media.
Hello. I didn't see you there. Could I perhaps trans your gender? Yu Kamimura is an interesting character. Her actress, who goes by the stage name Kaba-chan, is a transgender woman who was out as a gay man during Wizard's production. She brought the kind of performance you would expect from a queer performer who leans into their queerness for comedy, as though it was a sort of drag performance, especially viewed through the lens of the time. However, when you view her character through the lens of a transgender woman, her performance reveals several things about the character. First of all, consider that Kaba-chan is the first recurring LGBT character or actor to be featured in the series, at least as far as we know. Whether you see her as a cross-dresser based on the context of what you know, or when you saw the series, or what type of person the actress was out as at the time, Yu finds acceptance within her group. Haruto even flirts with her, if only to play with her heart, but still. For all intents and purposes, nothing she does is seen as especially strange to her group, and she's never treated like an outsider. But before we can talk about the rest of the reason why I love Kamimura, we need to talk about magical girls. Arguably speaking, the first magical girl show was Sally the Witch, which aired in Japan starting in 1966. Magical girls used to primarily focus on daily situations focused around a family and their magical circumstances, but became more battle-focused over time with entries like Princess Knight and eventually Cutie Honey, Sailor Moon, and Revolutionary Girl Utena becoming popular. This provided role models that girls and boys admired alike. During the boom of these kinds of magical girl shows, another phenomena was occurring in Japan regarding stories about Class S relationships. Class S covers the genre of stories featuring women in a state between friendship and love that is engaged in before girls become women, between friendship and love as well as girlhood and womanhood. This somewhat reflects reality, seeing as how, in Japan, homosexual relationships between girls are considered okay if they don't distract from straight relationships once they start considering settling down for their future. Magical girl stories not only represent many coming-of-age tropes, but by becoming popular around the same time as Class S relationships, with the same young female audience, it only seemed a natural fit to feature queer relationships in those stories, as they represented something that happens during the time a girl can become a magical girl, which was typically something that happens in high school, especially around the time that you started seeing more of these shows pop up that included same-sex relationships in the series. Also, while the magical girl genre transcends the idea that entertainment made for girls can only be enjoyed by girls, they also transcend the idea that gender expression and love can be boxed in by gender markers. This all makes for great female empowerment stories, and has also led to queer role models for young girls and women who felt like outcasts in their lives. In fact, you could even say many transgender people were inspired by characters like the Sailor Starlights and Utena. I know I was. In 1990, a live-action magical girl comedy called, and I don't speak French, so bear with me, but I am going to butcher this, La Belle Fille Masquée Poitrine, aired in Japan 2 years before the debut of Sailor Moon's manga. Although definitely not the first action-oriented magical girl series, it definitely occupied an iconic space in the minds of 1990s fans of the genre, and served as a somewhat more rare tokusatsu example of the genre. Not only that, it's one of Ishinomori's own magical girls, and a much more modern example compared to his 70s show Sarutobi Etchan, which was not an action-oriented series. For Yu Kamimura to take on this role as the Poitrine of her underworld allows the same kind of trans femme who grew older with the spirit of magical heroines in her heart to portray that role and inspire children and toku fans of all ages, and is a great honor for the character and actress to play such a significant Ishinomori character. Yu Kamimura is now forever a part of Poitrine and Ishinomori's history, as well as the history of magical girls, as yet another queer icon to the genre's great pantheon.
Hi there, KomradeKrisis here, Metsubo Jinrai Australia. I am your favourite agender robot, sorry Naki, and I'm here to take a fine-toothed lens to this absolute goddamn hot mess of a crossover cinema experience. And more specifically, how it relates to a different kind of crossover experience where you're like crossing over from one side of things to another, you know, sort of a trans across the thing, like transition. Look, we're talking about being trans today. We're talking about gender stuff and how it relates to Kamen Rider X Wizard and Fourze, Movie Wars Ultimatum, I think, is what it's called. Now, if you're somehow blindingly oblivious to the way that I look, talk, dress, act, or sound, you may be wondering what makes me qualified to speak on this topic. Well, to summarize a lifelong journey of self-discovery as quickly as possible, I was assigned male at birth, never really meshed with traditional gender roles for males growing up. Around about my teenage years, I started experimenting with my gender through cross-dressing, mostly as a joke. We will get to that later. Around about age 16, I had the oh shit moment when I realized that I didn't want to take the clothes off after this joke stopped being funny anymore. And 2 years later, when I turned 18 and was legally an adult, I came out to my parents and started physically transitioning to live as a trans woman. Now, it's worth noting that I hadn't actually needed to wait until I was 18 to come out and start transitioning, probably. My parents have always been hippie nerds, firmly ensconced within the burgeoning Australian science fiction and fantasy communities, and they're two of the most kindest and loving and most welcoming people I've ever met in my entire life. But unfortunately, the overwhelming narrative that surrounded transness in my life was one with only one possible future for me, that of ostracization, ridicule, hatred, bigotry, just a real shit time for the rest of my life, to be frank. Everything I'd experienced up until that point, from casual comments from friends who didn't know I was trans, to talking to other people about their own coming out experiences, and especially the media narrative surrounding transitioning and coming out, told me that even the most loving and caring people could still find hatred in their hearts, especially for trans people. My parents were 1000% fine with me transitioning, like I said. They are very welcoming and caring and accepting people. But the 2 years that I spent thinking about that really gave me a firm sense of conviction that this wasn't just some fleeting identity crisis, that I definitely had some sort of deep-rooted difficulty with my assigned gender. Unfortunately, however, I also learned that in those 2 years, it's something that was extremely detrimental to my mental health if left unchecked. I actually ended up dropping out of high school entirely, but without graduating. I failed year 11. I withdrew from pretty much all of my various social activities and groups and friends that I had at the time, mostly because I could not escape the constant feeling that the person who they saw in me was not the person who I thought that I was, and I just felt fake and also hidden and trapped and screaming without a mouth. Mostly because of the inescapable feeling that the person that they thought I was wasn't the person that I knew I was. It's just an unbelievable feeling of feeling trapped within your own skin. Luckily, through finding acceptance and love from my then partner, now fiancé, and by finding the strength and power of a queer community online and in the world around me, I managed to avoid falling even harder into isolation and depression that I already had. No longer spending every single day inside playing Fallout New Vegas as a girl character, and insisting whenever anybody asks that it is purely and solely because the guy characters are really ugly, and because if you're going to be playing a game where you get to see your character's butt a bunch while you're playing around, because I like playing in third person mode, you know, you get the melee weapons, it looks good, it looks way better than first person. You know, I'd rather be staring at a girl's butt for all those hours and stuff. Am I right, fellas? That's relatable content, right? And instead, I took the first steps towards actualizing my ideal self in the outside world, rather than remaining trapped inside my own inner world. If you've seen the movie that this video is about, you might be sort of starting to see where I'm going with this. Anyway, long fucking story short, I came out, physically and socially transitioned, and then lived as a trans woman for 6 years, before realizing that what I'd done was just swap one set of rigidly societally enforced gender roles for another flavor of those, realized what I actually wanted was freedom from the entire system itself and all of this gender bullshit, and became the fantastically androgynous agender engineering disaster in slow motion that now sits before you. Oh, and I've also worked as an educator and peer counselor on sex and gender in various paid and volunteer roles, from academia through private business, volunteer, non-profit groups, government agency like advisory services, things like that, for about 5 or 6 years on and off. That's probably relevant experience to this particular topic, maybe. So getting back to this actual hot mess of a triple movie roller coaster, I want to start off by just saying that I knew going into this that there were trans themes present in the films. In fact, the only reason I watched the movie is because Tim asked me to for this video, and because I can't say no to a queer in a suit. Now that's not to say I don't love Kamen Rider Wizard. I've watched a decent amount of it, and everything I've seen so far has been fucking fantastic. But the combination of ADHD and an extremely busy life schedule has prevented me from finishing the series and its associated movies. I just wanted to get this out of the way now, because despite my ongoing and well-documented love for tokusatsu media, as well as, generally being queer and looking for queer themes in TV shows and other pieces of media, I've noticed that a lot of the queer themes that I tend to read in a piece of media, I presume that they are just something that I've read into that myself, my own interpretation, rather than something concrete that the writers actually intended, especially when it comes to Kamen Rider and Super Sentai. This sentiment is shared pretty widely among a lot of other queer people that I've spoken to, mostly because of the long history of people like us either never being represented in media, or when we are represented, being shown as either explicitly villains or as someone who is otherwise deserving of an unhappy ending. I mean, hell, look no further than the bury your gays trope and the many villains in all forms of media who are either queer-coded or explicitly queer or trans, many of those, I'm going to add, being trans women. This problem can be found in all forms of media from all time periods and cultures. It's certainly nothing unique to Kamen Rider and Super Sentai, but I do find it especially and kind of worryingly prevalent in these two shows. The combination of Japan's historically quite conservative values, not that Western countries are much better, but it's still worth noting, alongside the fact that Kamen Rider and Super Sentai are both essentially prime-time kids' entertainment, combine to create an environment where almost all queer content is either a punchline or covered in so many layers of plausible deniability that it really is up to the viewers, and in the case of my own filthy Bakugaijin asses, the unpaid translators, interpretation. And like I said, this is nothing new or unique to Tokusatsu or Kamen Rider or Super Sentai. We're currently living in the age of Disney's 17th first queer character, who is still somehow just a background minor character with less than 2 seconds of screen time, no lines of dialogue, but yet still somehow has a name and an entire wiki page dedicated to them, purely for the purposes of pandering to queer fans. But I do find it worth noting, especially because one of the very few examples of explicitly queer content that we see in either Kamen Rider or Super Sentai comes from Rider Time Ryuki. An 18+ spin-off that was never aired on live TV, has questionable canonicity, where the aforementioned queer characters kill their friend with a steak knife over lunch very casually, then fuck, and then try to kill each other later on in the episodes. Now I'm just saying, my own feelings about a wild night of gay sex and murder aside, Toei's not exactly a paragon of queer representation, let's say. So, if I hadn't known that there were trans themes going into it, I think it's probably safe to assume that I would have missed a lot of them. Right up until the point where we get hit with the absolute classic, funny, big reveal of the pretty girl was actually the trans woman character this whole time. Isn't that funny? It's so funny that we're gonna let you know that this is supposed to be funny and you're supposed to be laughing at this, and this is not actually like a genuine reveal that that Haruto could actually potentially be attracted to you. And we know that because they play the goofy comedy music over the top of it, and you know, it makes you laugh and makes you feel like everything's really silly. And then then you like chases Haruto around the base, and like she screams about, you know, like, oh, you promised, and you pledged yourself to me, you said we'd meet in the, you know, and she's like boy crazy, you know, but it's funny because she's, you know, not a woman, and Haruto thought that she was until just now. Yeah, it's really funny. It's super funny, real good. But instead, having that particular lens of my critical eye focused in prior to watching the movie left me, I was just mostly confused. And this unnecessarily transphobic punchline is delivered to the audience in lieu of the big reveal romantic scene that they were expecting. Like seriously, just do me a favor, load up widely beloved 90s and 2000s sitcom Friends on Netflix. Sit down and watch a couple of episodes, maybe a couple dozen, and see how many episodes you can get through without just a trans person being thrown in as the punchline to a joke, even when the prior setup of that joke did not actually have anything to do with trans people or queer identities in any way. And decided to sort of half pull their punches, making the Dreamworld version of you her younger self, as opposed to what I thought was the really obvious route of just making her, like, use idealized body or her internal self or how she views herself in her mind, sort of like the Matrix residual self-image concept. I'm really proud of myself for only making like 2 Matrix references throughout this entire video, despite the fact that, I mean, both films share a lot of, you know, sort of, you know, dream worlds, fantasy, it's going to destroy the world, blah, 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 it's the big bad's plot, similarities. And I'm not just talking about the general ambient state of confusion that comes from being a polyamorous, pansexual, non-binary, transgender person. I was just really confused about what the intent of the movie even was supposed to be at the end of the day. I hadn't been prepared for the possibility of trans content prior to watching this, then that big punchline reveal moment that plays directly into the mindset and narrative behind the trans panic defense would have just completely ruined the entire movie for me, as well as probably my night, potentially the rest of the next day as well. I don't want to mince words here. This reveal and Haruto's reaction to it are the funny ha-ha side of the very same narrative that leads to trans people around the world being murdered in cold blood by bigots who then walk free because they claimed that they were just so disgusted at the very nature of us existing and that one of us could approach them with romantic or sexual intent that they were just forced to murder us in cold blood, that disgust of us overriding every single one of their very good and decent moral impulses. Based on that alone, I would have happily written the entire movie off as transphobic as fuck. Were it not for the literal pages and pages of notes that I'd written in the preceding hours of all the various things that I'd noticed that could either be literal, like, trans tropes, or just potentially, like, interpretations or things like that. Yeah, awkward. Now, like I said back in my introduction, I started to explore my gender through cross-dressing initially, and I justified this behavior to my peers and gave it a level of plausible deniability by treating it all as a joke. Which I knew to do because from a very young age, the vast majority of us are taught that a man in a dress is funny. It's a punchline. It's an entire joke in and of itself. So I'm completely used to being the punchline of jokes in media because I used many of those same jokes to provide myself cover as I explored my own identity. This shit is the background radiation of our lives, tossed around carelessly to finish off a joke that a lazy sitcom writer couldn't be bothered actually finishing. I haven't sat through it and done the maths myself, but without being hyperbolic, I'm fairly certain the number is probably in the single digits maximum. So when faced with an outside world that is so saturated in casual, everyday bigotry, it makes a lot of sense that a lot of trans people would choose to isolate themselves away from the world that constantly tries to hurt and other them. It may be somewhat unsurprising to hear that many trans people, both closeted and out, find refuge in online spaces, finding love and making friendships on social media spaces, Discord servers, games like MMOs and RPGs and VR chat that give you a wide range of character customization in choosing what your idealized perfect body should look like. Especially RPGs, MMOs, or platforms like VR chat that allow you a huge range of character customization that lets you really explore and find and actualize your real true interpretation of yourself. Yu's fantasy world is one where she is universally loved and appreciated by those around her. Crowds of adoring fans that cheer her on and celebrate her as she fights against the evils of this world, and everyone even remembers and celebrates her birthday. Something else that was absolutely not lost on me is the fact that Yu's fantasy includes her being able to rescue and care for people without being seen as just as much of a risk as the evils she's fighting. Most notably, her dream world allows her the chance to shelter a group of children from harm and protect them. I felt like this was a really important thing to see because of the long ongoing history of trans women being seen as predators or pedophiles or as wanting to corrupt children into being trans themselves. Some trans women also describe experiencing a sense of misplaced motherhood, both from not being able to give birth to their own children, as well as being societally segregated from teaching or childcare roles out of fear of being accused of having harmful intent. The character of Poitrine also seems like a very deliberate choice for Yu's Henshin alter ego, considering that she's based off a magical girl heroine from early tokusatsu days that apparently Sailor Moon was heavily inspired by. I personally have a long and complicated history with regards to Sailor Moon and gender. I remember watching it as a child and being filled with all these confusing and overwhelming feelings, especially when Usagi started her transformation sequence. I never understood these feelings until I grew up, transitioned, and rewatched the show as an adult after years of attending therapy sessions and exploring my own feelings. Essentially, it was the feeling of gender envy, of wanting to be that effortlessly beautiful and graceful. Now, you may have noticed that beautiful and graceful is not really what I'm going for these days, but bear in mind that back at this point when I first watched the show, I was still feeling completely societally constrained by the male gender roles that had been placed upon me. I still remember my first day of kindergarten, preschool, daycare, whatever, when I was told that my favorite color couldn't be pink because pink was a girl's color. And bear in mind, I wasn't told that by some conservative adult or one of the daycare workers. I was being told that by another child, like also probably 4 or 5, who had already been brainwashed into believing and perpetuating these rigid stereotypes before they could basically even form sentences. Going back to thinking about the dream world concept, there are a couple moments throughout the movie that felt really poignant to me when viewed through the lens of a transgender analysis. The first one of these is that when Haruto confronts Yu about the fact that she's stuck inside a dream world, she tells him that she already knows that. As a trans person, I personally feel like she would have been able to tell immediately that it wasn't reality, because she would have immediately been free of all the daily micro and macro aggressions that make up the background radiation of a trans person's life, as I said before. In fact, she's initially quite resistant to leaving the fantasy world, at least up until the point that she's informed that other people could be hurt by her choosing to remain there, at which point she pretty much immediately decides to unplug herself from the Matrix with only a couple moments of hesitation. There's another moment that I thought was really, really important here in this later part of the movie, where Haruto tells Yu that they'll meet again in reality. The implication, of course, being this is a very romantic gesture. He's telling her that it's going to be better on the outside now because he'll be there to form a relationship with her and they'll take care of each other or something. You know, it's never stated exactly like that in the film, but the implication is heavy. It's added to by the fact that up to this point, Haruto and Yu have shown to have quite a strong spark of connection, at least when in the character of Poitrine. They fight together, they have good synergy, they're funny and, you know, responsive to each other, they've got good chemistry. But when Haruto says, "let's meet in reality," Yu looks visibly confused and lost and doubtful for a second, looking away, looking down away from the camera. She clearly has a moment of strong internal conflict. Haruto telling her this, while intending to be a way to pull her out of the dream world and make her feel better about rejoining reality, actually sort of makes her want to stay in it even more, because she knows that she and Haruto have already met in reality dozens, if not hundreds of times. And she knows that his fragile sense of masculinity won't allow him to create that sort of connection that they're able to explore in this dream environment. This is partially tangential, but I've done my own research into cybersex and the psychology and thoughts and drives behind it. And you see that a lot of people saying that the reason they're drawn to it is because of the safety and anonymity that it provides them to explore aspects of their personal gender identity, their sexuality, their gender, or their kinks, or anything like that, in a way that allows them to be safe and not risk being socially stigmatized, physically harmed, or taken to by the court. Because it allows them the safety to explore their gender and sexuality and other parts of their identity with like-minded This is especially the case in countries and communities around the world where queer identities and queer sex are criminalized, or at the very least subject to immense social stigma. Now, there are a couple of other moments throughout the film that felt particularly noteworthy or interesting for me to talk about. Some of these do start to get a little abstract, but stick with me, it's probably worth it. Something that immediately stuck out to me is that the very first thing that we see of you as Poitrine in the dream world is a pair of white Doc Martens. Now, I'm not 1000% sure what sort of connotations Doc Martens have in Japan, but at least in my Western experience, Doc Martens are very heavily associated with the queer experience, or at the very least the queer aesthetic. Doc Martens company even embraces this, putting out several different varieties of pride-themed accessories and shoes every year. Back when I was at university, I often made the joke that every single time I'd start a new class, I'd look out amongst the fellow classmates, see which of them had dyed hair, then look down around their feet and see which of them were wearing Doc Martens, and then usually the ones that had both were like almost certainly queer in some way or another. Add in the fact that the color white is often associated with purity and innocence, and I started to think that it was definitely a deliberate choice to have Doc Martens be the first thing that we see of you, both in her initial reveal as Poitrine in the dream world, and then in her gag punchline reveal at the end of the movie in her regular form. That said, it could just be a reference to the fact that this movie has a lot of time travel in it. Because it's a pair of docs. Like a paradox. Like a time paradox. Yeah. The editing choices in this movie are also kind of confusing, and not gonna lie, sometimes kind of off-putting. Specifically, I'm referring to the choice to edit little ding noises into the audio track every time Nadeshiko does a fight move that accentuates, shows off, or just straight up impacts somebody with her butt. Now, I'm clearly no prude, and I love me some Google butt as much as the next internet poisoned freak. But the fact that Nadeshiko is a pile of glitter glue that has taken on the appearance of an underage schoolgirl that is literally always wearing a schoolgirl uniform just feels a bit weird to be focusing on her butt so much. That said, there is at least one scene in which Nadeshiko does a spin attack while untransformed, and the camera zooms in on her skirt as she spins around and it goes all around at the sides and stuff, and like it goes really slow motion and like romantic harp strings play and stuff. And that one shot didn't feel particularly predatory to me, but as somebody who's been a trans woman, I can confirm that skirt go spinny is one of the most weirdly alluring and visually and sensory satisfying things that you can ever hope for to achieve and then to finally achieve. It's just a weird little thing that is very much a... I think it's mostly just that it's kind of emblematic of an entire subset of both clothing and behavior that feels entirely fenced off and impossible for people who are assigned male at birth to achieve. This is probably entirely unintentional, but goddamn if I didn't feel seen by that particular editing cut. In terms of other probably unintentional trans-positive moments, Haruto becomes a trans ally for an entire 2 whole seconds when he calls you a good girl, which, fun fact, is one of the 5 secret code phrases that can turn a trans woman's stomach to butterflies instantly. I'm not at liberty to tell you the other 4. Trade secrets, you understand. Speaking of trans allies, can I just say that my man Gentaro would not have recoiled from you if he was in Haruto's place? Like, just look at Gentaro's ongoing relationship with a puddle of space goo, and tell me that William T, the T stands for Try Anything Twice Riker, does not live in this Chad of a king. Oh yeah, and last thing about iconography. Pretty much the entire first third of this movie has this whole ongoing extended butterfly metaphor leading up to Inazuman's reveal, where he goes from being the golden child of a genocidal neo-Nazi-esque organization to being a defender of justice. There's probably all sorts of symbolism you can find there about how bigotry and distrust of the other drives people further into radicalization, but that acceptance and love of one's true self by the people around them can help them to further actualize that true self and become stronger and in turn help the people around them. But I don't know, the butterfly metaphoric, but I don't know, the butterfly imagery was just, it was a little too on the nose. It felt like low-hanging fruit, you know? So, thinking about the experience as a whole, the fact that the entire movie seems like a very genuine and heartfelt love letter to classic tokusatsu, that also has a decent helping of at least what appears to be nuanced and informed references to the trans experience. But then the climax builds up to a final payoff of a weak-ass, played-out transphobic gag that just makes every minute of the preceding handful of hours feel just kind of weak and hollow and insincere. The fact that Yu is essentially just a comic relief character with a bunch of pretty outdated and harmful tropes stapled onto her in the majority of the show itself, but then is portrayed throughout this movie as a detailed and interesting character who is wonderfully kind and deserving of love, almost makes it feel like this film is an apology from the writing team for how they treated Yu throughout the rest of the show. But at the same time, it also just kind of feels like they wrote a wholesome and trans-positive movie by accident, and then once they realized what they'd done, it was too late to fix it, so they just made the big reveal into a punchline instead. The fact that there's a secondary reveal inside this punchline that Yu's Dreamworld self is actually what she looked like when she was younger just makes it even weirder, frankly. There is a long and unfortunate history of media portrayals of trans women, mostly portraying them as very unattractive and masculine. Look no further than the fact that Yu is portrayed throughout the series by a drag queen, and not very flatteringly, rather than being portrayed by a trans woman, or at the very least by a cisgender woman like her younger self is in this dream world. Quick side note, I left that last section in the script as kind of a reminder to double check your facts and not make quick assumptions. Yu Kamimura was played in Kamen Rider Wizard and its movies by multidisciplinary entertainer Kaba-chan, who at the show's time of filming was indeed performing as a drag performer. But I looked it up and it turns out that she actually came out as a trans woman just a few years later in 2014. Given this context, I think it's definitely at least more likely that the hints and things I picked up throughout this movie were at least potentially deliberate. But obviously, at the end of the day, I have no access to the actors, writers, directors, or anybody that was part of the production, and even if I did, Nihongo wa hanasemasen very fucking well. But I would really like to know how Kaba-chan herself feels about this movie, about Wizard, about that particular reveal scene itself, and whether or not, or how much of a hand she may have had in crafting her character's experiences and portrayal throughout this movie and the rest of the series. Anyway, the weird mishmash of everything that's happening here just personally makes me kind of feel like they realized while shooting the end scene that it was unnecessarily cruel, and then they decided to sort of half pull their punches back from the punch they were throwing that was unnecessary in the whatever, anyway. As well as the fact that both movies featured dynamo creatives that then later came out as trans women. Anyway, I found Kamen Rider X, Kamen Rider Wizard and Fourze Movie Wars Ultimatum to be altogether just kind of a mixed bag. It has the usual amount of chaotic over-the-top shenanigans and fun crossover Easter eggs that we've come to expect from the crossover movies, plus a heaping serve of references and content for fans of vintage tokusatsu shows. But the addition of a storyline thread that the writers didn't have the guts to fully commit to without resorting to cheap, harmful jokes just really sours the experience, especially when it had the potential to be a rare piece of completely trans-positive content in modern tokusatsu media. If they just decided to take that reveal scene in a different, more progressive direction, instead of just resorting to the same tired old tropes that result in people getting murdered, then I'd probably be sitting here completely and wholeheartedly recommending that people watch it. Unfortunately, I just can't recommend it without providing some heavy caveats or content warnings for the ending. I still enjoyed my experience watching the movie, but ultimately, if you didn't enjoy it, I really don't blame you. However, it does at least signal to me that there are people within Toei's production staff that want to write stories that are actually about queer people. And personally, I really look forward to seeing how this plays out in the coming series of Kamen Rider and Super Sentai that come after this and into the future. You know, I think we'll probably be very much likely to see some more trans storylines and content, even in the mainstream TV series and the actual episodes of the show, you know? Hang on. Ah, fuck. It came out 10 years ago. God damn it. Well, never mind about that. Thanks for listening to me. And when it comes to lengthy tangential trans analysis of really obscure media, I'm KomradeKrisis, and I'm your Tran.
Thank you very much to both of our guests, Henshin Sunrise and KomradeKrisis, both of whom you should follow, for offering a lot of nuance that I had completely overlooked in my initial thoughts. The Akumaizer 3, in my opinion, although I feel like this one's also pretty straightforward and on the nose, represent conservative masculinist standards of older tokusatsu entries, especially those of the 70s, with their being based off of Alexandre Dumas's Three Musketeers. I won't go into too much detail here, the big point is they suck, but Lost in Adaptation has a fantastic series of videos thoroughly detailing just how absolutely shitty these dudes are in-universe, and I very much recommend it for a deeper understanding, but some of their war crimes include sexual assault, blackmail, murder, and they are basically just awful little trash goblins. So why did we treat them as otherwise for so long in our media? Doesn't that send a really ugly message about what behaviors define masculinity and femininity to children from a very young and impressionable age? By no means am I calling Zabuton from Akumaizer's 3 a sex pest or anything, by the way, but it was very much a 70s show, and women were treated very incidentally, if not outright disempowered, in favor of male plot progress. In the film, the Akumaizer 3 planned to use stories to contort the narratives of the Dreamers into evil self-defeatist rhetoric. Their plan is constantly referred to as a stage show, and framed as such, an illusion cast by them for the sake of exploiting their audience. Burying their narrative is represented by driving the demons underground, pushing it out of sight, where it only occasionally seeps back up into the mainstream. The characters of both Three Musketeers and Oscar Miser Threezers do have a lot of archetypal traits that haven't necessarily aged well. No big surprise considering the concept of traditional romantic chivalry is effectively replaced by a push for radical egalitarianism in today's world. This doesn't make it inherently bad media, it just makes it a product of its time, and we should view it as such and acknowledge that in our criticism of it. Like, Makio, in a way, isn't out here doing blackface, unlike some people I know, you know what I mean? It's just sort of got boomer vibes is all. I'm actually really surprised by how much I enjoyed it, especially given my disdain for the source material, but, like, that's Shotaro Ishinomori for you. And we see that age reflected especially poorly contrasted against the modern zeitgeist defined by both of these shows, especially because one of Kamen Rider Wizard's core themes, as a show about a character going through the stages of grief, is the importance of the legacy that we leave behind. As far as I'm aware, there have been about 24 film adaptations of the Three Musketeers in the century since its inception, but the time between them grows longer and longer with each entry. To date, it's been 11 years since the last one released, with the next one announced basically a full decade later, and there hasn't really been any news since that announcement, which is so often the case with modern Western cinema, am I right? They're effectively relegated to name-drop references at this point. A boomer meme. And that's nothing to even sneeze at. That's certainly more adaptations than any of my work will ever receive. That's a filmography to rival Metal Heroes? How many seasons of Metal Heroes are there? I hope there's 24. However, as time has gone on, it seems that people have less attachment to the franchise, the characters, the ideals of the Three Musketeers. And I think that's in large part due to the civil rights movements that have erupted internationally in the century since it debuted. Social norms have changed, and genre conventions have become outmoded and been replaced or evolved to meet the challenge of the time and its new audience. People refine the concepts into the Scarlet Pimpernel, the Justice League, the Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, Dr. Detroit, adding so much to the story as to completely transform its identity. Oh my god, it's like the guy who turns into a cocoon and then he becomes a butterflyman and he stops being such a fucking Tyler Durden all the time. Oh my god, it's a metaphor! Conversely, Sailor Moon has been experiencing a steady stream of both new media and re-releases ever since its debut. In fact, recently there's been a sudden boom of content over the past few years as 90s queers have grown up and obtained disposable income. There are constantly multiple adaptations in the works, both animated and live-action tokusatsus, even musicals, like there used to be for Dumas's work, to the point where sometimes it almost feels oversaturated, not that I'm complaining. But where Sailor Moon redefined the magical girl genre from Tokyo Mew Mew to Madoka Magica, Sailor Moon itself was defined by La Belle Fille Masquée Poitrine. Seriously, look at this. It's the exact same family. It's like they walked out of the panel. Or I guess it more accurately is like Naoko Takeuchi just drew them. This isn't like a gotcha moment. Naoko Takeuchi has been very public in citing Poitrine as the direct inspiration for her work, and I think it's especially apparent throughout Sailor Moon, from the characters and set designs to their henshin devices and their weapons, Sailor V's mask, the catchphrases and incorporation of rhythmic gymnastics into the transformation sequences. Chibiusa shows up later. It challenged the gender norms of both the time and its inspiration media, presenting Usagi less as the idealized young woman that Toei gave us, but as a real human woman, with flaws and issues to overcome in life. She isn't meant to brandish a flag of toxic values. She's meant to challenge girls to define their own values to themselves by presenting them with heightened dramatizations of real problems they'll come across growing up, be it creepy dudes or predatory capitalist identity politics. Zabuton from Akumaizer 3 believes that humans and demons are equivalent, and the movie contorts that into a more sinister bent with his analog, Zatan, preying on our worst aspects in order to breed an army of demons. Much the way that Dumas's book encouraged some pretty reprehensible attitudes in regards to gender roles and identity that inevitably led to some violence down the line. It's a distorted mirror revealing the insidious true forms of the lessons that the story imparted. Yu, however, is an egg who took a little longer to hatch and is dreaming of the childhood that she was denied, where every day is her birthday, so the whole world is forced to acknowledge her gender identity, which Haruto and the gang already do every day when they patronize her donut stand and hang out, even actively loving her all movie while struggling to save her from herself. An egg, in loose queer terminology, can mean a person who is in a metaphorical embryo state of the trans person that they will eventually become. Yu is never able to blossom as an individual in her dream. She has a popular TikTok, but all of her relationships are parasocial. They're bot accounts, an illusion that she's using to avoid taking risks with real people out of a very real and very valid fear of rejection. She's forced to perform as some dickhead from the 70s' antiquated idea of what the perfect idol schoolgirl would be rather than exist as she is, and anytime she would gain any development from the experience, it resets. Ganma is the voice in her ear telling her that she'll never quite be good enough to pass as a cis woman in the eyes of random passerby. This is anecdotal, but I have several queer friends who are transitioning who have expressed to me that they find VTubing to be less stressful and toxic than streaming their faces, because there's a level of disconnection between the unidealized human streamer and the idealized animated version of themselves that they portray. However, over the past few weeks, as there have been further and further official lobbies against queer and trans people specifically, there are a lot of them that are finding it creates a level of gender dysphoria for them that they'll never be able to attain this body, and it just sort of becomes triggering to look at their own content, which sucks. This movie is about Yu learning to accept herself for who she is and embrace living her life honestly so she can finally be happy in the reality that she's constantly trying to escape. She's too busy pining for everything that she's lost out on in childhood to move forward with her life and make any actual progress with it. The monster assigned to Yu, specifically named Ganma, could be easily read as gender dysphoria, especially given the way that he's shown to brainwash Yu into rejecting the very people trying to help her. He grants her power, but under an assumed identity where nobody actually knows who she is and therefore can't actually get to know her at all, as evidenced by the shock of the reveal in the finale when she unmasks. It's only by rejecting Ganma's influence that Yu is able to perform to her peak as a woman with the assistance of her therapist Haruto, regardless of how much she passes as a cis woman in the eyes of random strangers that she's never going to see again passing by on the street. The onus of the lesson is on her friends to do better and to back up the speeches that they made all movie, and we see throughout the series that they continue to be supportive of Yu's transition and identity. I think that this is why Nadeshiko came back for this movie. Nadeshiko, as I briefly mentioned earlier, is literally a tube of space slime that emulates the first woman that she ever saw. She's autistic, she is nonverbal throughout the majority of both of her appearances, and Gentaro is madly in love with her despite knowing all of this. It all bleeds back into that recurring idea of found family in all of Shotaro Ishinomori's works, the idea that what binds us as a community isn't genetics, but acceptance born of a deeper understanding of each other's issues. Kazuto's struggle to not fall victim to the same insecurities as Yu draws a direct parallel between the cishet youths in the movie and the trans youths in the movie, encouraging a connection rooted in empathy and dismissing the idea that a single societal standard needs to be adhered to in order for people to feel accepted, to be valued. I appreciate that his arc is once again his learning to overcome his more masculinist traits in favor of embracing femininity by making peace with his classmate Miope. Similarly, Gentaro's segment reminds queer people in the audience that romantic love is in fact attainable for us, and frankly we just don't see enough of that on television, even a full decade later. The lesson Haruto teaches Yu in this film is that she does not need to live up to the romantic archetypal standards of the 1890s womanhood in order to qualify as a woman to the people who actually matter in her life at all. She merely needs help getting out of that headspace to stop internalizing what society wants from her and discover what she wants for herself. A lesson which I, personally, mine endless value from despite its clunky final moments. Haruto and Fourze respect these queers for how they identify as individuals, rather than the escapist fantasies that they have to concoct in order to feel empowered. They don't dismiss the pain that their victims are feeling, but they recognize that their coping mechanisms are becoming unhealthy, and offer them resources to help live their best lives more openly and honestly, which in turn teaches them more about themselves and better informs them about how to help people moving forward. And that's why we need queer media. So that we as a species can continue to grow and evolve and tell a new story that isn't just regurgitating a 100-year-old legend written by a creep fighting to protect an outmoded monarchy. So that other people have a chance to see potential for a happy life when they go out into the world. So that people like me can finally have a sense of belonging. Thank you so much for watching. As you know, our channel is run entirely on donations at the moment, so if you would like to help a queer creator for Pride Month, I will have links to my Patreon and Kofi in the description below this video. Thank you very much to our current investors for the month, Cody, Chris, Esther, and Seth. If you're interested in getting something back for your money, we also sell pins and keychains with more merch to come. I will have a store linked below. If you would like to stay up to date with the channel in real X time, then my Facebook and my Twitter will also be linked below. I tend to use Twitter a lot more these days because it sucks less, but I post at least once a day on both. You should be seeing a sub button and a playlist pop up right about now, so if you would like to help us defeat the Humagear algorithm, feel free to like, sub, hit the bell, comment, share the video, all that good stuff to keep us on your feed. For now, however, I'm afraid that's our time. As always, I've been Tim Shields, and when it comes to tokusatsu, I'm your guy.